Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is supported by the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Telecommunications Access Minnesota, and Nisswa Tax Service. Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Across from City Hall in Nisswa and online at nisswatax.com.
Good evening and welcome to Lakeland Currents. Imagine, if you will, at one time Minnesota had over 1,000 school districts. Of course, many of them were in rural Minnesota and many of them had 1 or 2 teachers. But imagine today we have only 340. And many of those 340 school districts are having a very tough time, if probably not all of them, having a very tough time just operating. Annie Cook looks at what Nisswa is doing to raise extra funds just to keep their schools going.
It's the Fool's Auction, a Saturday night social event that helps Nisswa Elementary continue to provide a well-rounded education.
All proceeds will go for technology, arts programming, world language programs. We have Spanish and a French flair program at Nisswa School. So we're really excited about all of those things that this can provide.
In 2006, the school was faced with budget cuts. The art program was on the chopping block, and that's something the parent-teacher organization didn't want to happen.
They had to take some type of action to get some money into the school system so that they keep the art program going.
That was the reason for the first year, but the district's financial situation didn't get better, so the auction became an annual event, and it's now in its 4th year.
We all know with the cutbacks with the school district, it's a great fundraiser, it's a great community activity. The community is so actively involved. It's a special event and everybody really enjoys coming.
The students at Nisswa will be $12,000 richer from the auction, and though this is less than in past years, the school still needs the revenue.
We wouldn't have an after-school Spanish program. We wouldn't have the French flair for all of our 2nd graders. We wouldn't have a lot of our field trips.
This trend of private funding for public schools is something that's becoming increasingly common in the area. In the Brainerd Lakes area alone, public schools have had to look to private funding sources to help pay for athletics, arts, music, language, and even something as simple as field trips. Without these private sources, many of these programs would be lost in our public schools.
A lot of what is happening should be happening, and thank goodness that we have our Nisswa PTO and our community to make that happen.
And for the sake of the students and their education, it's essential that community support continues to happen. For Lakeland News at 10, I'm Annie Cook.
My guests this evening are almost like reading a who's who in education. They are 2 gentlemen who have a phenomenal background in K through 12 issues. And they're here tonight to talk about some of the stresses that are facing our public schools today. Lee Warren is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Rural Education Association. He's been a high school biology teacher. He's been a high school principal. He's been a superintendent. Hadn't learned his lesson yet. He's been a deputy director of an educational co-op and executive director of an educational cooperative service unit. Joe Graba has a list that we don't have time to go through today, but I'll get some of the highlights. He too was a high school biology teacher, a 3-term representative, a legislator who chaired the Education Finance Committee at one time. He's been the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Education, the Chancellor of the Minnesota Technical College System, the Executive Director of the Higher Education Coordinating Board, Dean of Graduate School at Hamline University, and he's still working. He's a Senior Fellow for Education Evolving, and we'll get back to that in a minute, Joe, to talk about what that is. And tonight, for the first time, we have a collaborative partner in our show on Currents, and that's the Brainerd Daily Dispatch. And we hope to have these folks involved with us in most of our shows in the future. And tonight we have Mike O'Rourke, who is the Associate Editor for the Brainerd Daily Dispatch. So, gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for being here. And Lee, I know you just got through making a tour around the state, and maybe you could give us a little summary of the state of affairs in public education financing.
You know, it was interesting. I've spent the last probably 2.5 weeks meeting with superintendents in all parts of the state, and there's some really common themes that are coming out. And I don't know if crisis is the right word, but certainly there's a tremendous amount of angst among the leadership in K-12 about either the lack of money or the demands that are placed on the system and the inability to be able to deal with it. This is my 37th year. I think it's as bad as I've ever seen.
There's, I think there are 340 school districts right now. Do you think any of them are not in trouble?
I think there might be a few districts that probably, for one reason or another, are growing, which is very rare, at least among the rural districts, or they might be in a position today where they have a little bit of money in the bank. But it fluctuates because districts go through cycles. And so while they might have money this year because they passed a referendum just recently, the costs are continuing to rise in all fronts, and the revenue is not. And that's just not sustainable.
Tell us a little bit about what you do in your role as the executive director of the Minnesota Rural Education Association.
We have 150 school districts that cover all of the rural part of Minnesota, and we advocate on their behalf at the legislature. We train and we represent them and their interests as best we can. So if the issue of funding, we try to talk about it and educate people about what really goes on with school funding. We try to look at other opportunities for our members to learn about unique things that are going on and to help them work with one another and maybe get better at what they do.
Joe, what are you doing now? What is Educational Evolving? And you're a senior fellow with that organization.
Yeah, actually I was a co-founder of it's a small think tank, education policy think tank, and we work on K-12 education policy, and not just in Minnesota. To a large extent we work around the country, and we don't work with schools as much as we do with the policymakers in the states, the governors, legislators, foundations, and so on around the country, trying to get greater innovation, essentially, in our elementary, secondary system in this country. That's one of our beliefs, is that the system needs to undergo change in fundamental ways, Ray, and it's a very difficult task to change our public education system.
I'm not sure exactly what the budget deficit is that we're looking at in Minnesota yet, but you hear $5 to $6 billion.
Yes.
And I know that the Democrats in the Senate this week laid out a proposal for a 3% cut. And I know Charlie Kite is the executive director of the Minnesota School Superintendents Association, and he's saying that if that cut were to happen, it would probably affect about 5,500 teachers. What would that mean to the state of Minnesota?
Well, I think we're seeing some political posturing going on at the Capitol yet, but there's just no question but what they're going to come out of this legislative session with no increase or perhaps modest cuts in K-12 education, and and there are just cost drivers built into the system, and so if the revenue stays flat and the expenditures are driven upward by fuel costs or transportation costs or energy costs of any kind, it's going to force significant trimbacks in expenditures, no question.
Was that a surprise to you two gentlemen that the Democratic Senate came out asking for cuts in education?
Yeah, that's why I'm having trouble understanding why they did that, and we'll have to see how that plays out over the next few weeks. But one of the other things that everybody has to understand, I think, and that is that we are getting escalating competition for the state dollars and state tax dollars, and that's just going to grow and grow as our population ages and as more and more employers cut back on health insurance, and that's happening all over the country. State expenditures on health costs are escalating, and that creates a really difficult set of choices for legislators. Education has always been one of our top priorities, probably the top priority, but it's also difficult when you've got families that have been laid off and don't have health insurance to tell them that you're going to cut them out of the state health program as well. So that's part of the equation that we're dealing with, I think.
The Majority Leader, Senator Larry Pogmiller, said back in January that everybody should be cut and that while education is important, it wouldn't be, as sacred, and therefore expect it. We weren't hearing that necessarily from the House or from the governor, so it was a bit of a surprise, I think, to most people around the state when their proposal came out. And the omnibus ed bill that passed this week in the Senate calls for a 7% cut, but then they backfill money from the federal stabilization, and that ends up being about a 3.2% cut.
Lee, as you go around the state, what effect do you think this economic crisis is having on school boards as they negotiate wages for both administrators and teachers? Are you seeing wage freezes?
We're getting into some uncharted territory. I don't know that we've run into the kind of circumstances that we're seeing regarding the expectations of a salary freeze or a slight increase. And I don't know how boards necessarily are approaching this, because there's only a few of them that are starting. I believe in today's newspaper, out of one of the southeastern papers, was a story about, I believe it was Waseca proposed a soft freeze. I don't know how you define soft freeze, hard freeze, but I think there's a growing expectation and understanding by not only the board members, but also employees, that this is a different time. We haven't been here before, and our expectations may have to change. I don't know how that's going to play out, though.
I think it might be good to point out, Ray, to the public that there are automatic increases built into the salary schedules in virtually every school district. And because teachers, at least during the first 10, 12, 13 years, get increased income as their years of experience accumulate, and then they move across the salary schedule into different lanes if they've gone back to college and gotten graduate credits. And so when you talk about a freeze, you can think about it in different stages. You may simply say, we're not going to boost the salary schedule this year. That's different than saying nobody's going to move down on in the salary grid or over to the right on the salary lanes. So that's what I meant when I said I think there's built-in cost escalations, and even if the revenue stays flat, that doesn't mean that the districts won't have to cut. I think every district will be in a cut mode by the end of this fiscal year.
We're sort of reaching a stress point I think in our educational system here, and I know, Joe, you deal with that. You talk about things that are needed to change. What are you seeing in some of the other states, or what are you seeing in places? What kind of innovation are you starting to see?
Well, we think we're seeing greater willingness on the part of districts now. We've had the chartering sector that's created some pretty innovative schools, and we're now seeing districts become more open to creating new and different kinds of schools. Both chartered online schools and district-run online schools and state-run online schools are just exploding around the country. Literally millions of students now participating in some way in online education, and I think that that'll just continue to grow. But we think there are tremendous opportunities for increased productivity and efficiency by changing the model of schools, Ray. And that's really a difficult thing. Through the 80s and 90s, this country, well, maybe through the 70s and 80s, this country almost had no productivity growth, or very low productivity growth. And we had almost given up on the service sector experiencing productivity growth. And then towards the last half of the 90s and on into this new decade in the 21st century, those services have essentially driven the productivity improvements in our economy. And it was largely because they used the information technologies, the digital technologies, to change the processes that they used to carry. Just think of the banking industry as an example. You think about how we used to have to take our paychecks down and deposit them and hand them to a teller. And then we came ATMs. you know, I don't know, most people don't see a paycheck anymore. It simply goes in automatically. Even their bills are paid automatically, electronically. That's enormous efficiency and productivity growth. One of the dilemmas with education, those other services are developed around the outcomes they desire. Education is developed around the processes that we carry out. We built our schools around teaching, even though we know our purpose is to help children learn. And until we break out of that mold of designing schools around teaching and convert over to having schools built around student learning, I think it's almost impossible for us to benefit from these new technologies. And if we can find a way to move to schools designed around learning, we'll be able to realize productivity improvements just like some of the other services have. And I think that's where we have to go with education, not just elementary, secondary, but post-secondary education as well.
How might the role of the teacher change in that?
Well, I think it changes radically, and in a lot of ways, I think it changes in a positive way. If you can focus the experience for young people on learning, where they're excited about their learning and motivated because they're able to study areas that they're interested in and specialize in areas that they're good in, you then open up, you do away with the issue of classroom management problems that a lot of teachers find very frustrating. And it moves the teacher from being, as we like to say, the sage up on the stage in front of the class to being the guide at the side. It turns the job around. And the kind of schools that we're talking about, those teachers develop better relationships with the students than they do in the traditional arrangement. One of the sort of astounding discoveries is you hear teachers that teach in online schools saying that they have better relationships with the kids even when they never see them. Yeah, because they deal individually with them on their learning. And they might be 300 miles away, and but they get to know the kids better than, you know, most secondary teachers see a classroom come in every 50, 55 minutes. And you don't have much time between classes to develop relationships. And these teachers, so it's counterintuitive, but those relationships we think are key to both improving the motivation of students, but also improving their acquisition of learning.
Lee, if we didn't do anything, any innovation in our K-12 systems, it seems to me that the outcome of the way we're going is more students, fewer teachers, larger classrooms. And that seems to be not getting the job done. Do you see a crisis developing? Are we in a crisis now?
I think we're in the process of change. Some of the things that Joe is talking about, schools have been trying to adapt and adjust because they're already being pushed into that circumstance of larger classrooms and doing more with less. That's become a way of business, particularly for the rural districts. I genuinely believe that as teachers, and by the way, that teachers do a fabulous job. I think a lot of our kids, at least in the rural schools, really do as well as anybody anywhere, and I'm really excited about that. But it seems to me that if we don't innovate, if we don't do some of the things and embed them into what it is that we're doing today, we'll end up in that spot. But I think there's some unique things happening. There's some districts talking all around the state about changing the way they think. There's a group of about 25 down in the southwestern part of the state that have aligned their calendars to start at the same time, end at the same time of the day. Their periods are the same. And that doesn't sound like a big deal for everybody to do that. We can just agree to have that. But that's moving mountains because everybody was considered to be independent and strength on the independent school district. And there's a group up north of here who are talking about doing their back office function collectively so that they're trying to save money outside of the classroom and become extremely efficient, in the way that they conduct business so that they can do those things. So we're seeing a lot of those changes happening outside of the classroom. Inside the classroom, the use of technology it's interesting. As my own boys grew up and I watched them get into this, and they were talking to each other online and texting, and I used to think I was fairly okay with technology. I didn't really comprehend the way they connected and linked. And what Joe was talking about, since then I've done some teaching at the graduate ed at Southwest Minnesota State, and they use a Desire to Learn, a D2L system, which is an online system. And I've experienced what Joe's talking about, and it does work. My sense is we're going to see more of a hybrid system where there's going to be some of each. We can't get away from some of the expectations that we have as communities. Athletics alone. The other thing is when you bring all those kids together, it's a perfect opportunity for us to do things like inoculations or trainings, safety trainings, or if you have them spread all over, it's too hard to do those things. So over the years, schools, kids being brought together were the place to try and make some changes and differences. If we break all that apart, it would be too hard to do that. So my sense is we're going to see some mixtures, and we're going to see some schools branch off that are just totally unique. We're seeing that now. And we're going to see schools where they take components of that and embed them inside their systems.
There were 3 legislators, I believe, recently in the St. Cloud area that have talked about forming 3 county seats together into one. Mm-hmm. And I know for years there's been discussion in the higher ed side, Joel, that we have too many campuses. We just can't possibly afford to keep them all. Well, the irony is now a lot of these campuses are growing in enrollment because of the unemployment situation. Mm-hmm. But and I know when you were the chancellor of the technical college system, this debate was going on too. Can mergers occur anymore in the K-12 side to become more efficient in the traditional sense? And do you see the elimination of some of these campuses as we move towards new technologies? It's 2 questions for 2 of you, but.
Well, let me try to do the K-12 one quick. I think that we will see some mergers, but I think what we need to think about is more administrative mergers with the schools not being pulled out of the communities, especially the elementary schools, right? And in fact, we've had a piece of legislation that we've worked with Lee on for consideration. It may not pass this year, but it was designed to help create a planning mechanism for small rural districts that would help them begin to put together their administrative services. So you'd have one fiscal officer and maybe somebody in charge of facilities for multiple. They might even use the same contract for buses and then the goal was to, as most of the problem with declining enrollment is that those high school classes that are specialty science or foreign language start running very low on enrollments, and so it's very difficult to maintain enough faculty. And so sharing faculty and maybe moving to some online blend kind of coursework, all of those I think are possibilities. And I think we can get the economic benefits and the educational benefits by some merging of programming and administrative services without the agony of busing children for 2 hours a day. We're up against some of the real serious travel limits in some parts of the state.
Kids, you can only move kids so far. And we've gone through a couple of rounds of reorganizations of schools in terms of combining buildings and moving kids back and forth. And we're just at the point where we probably can't do a lot of that. The second thing is the communities have such strong expectations. I'm not sure young children should be moved very far anyway. They're better closer to home, and I think most people want that. However, there's no reason why we couldn't address the opportunity to combine some of the leadership and some of the support services, the back office stuff that Joe was talking about. We need to. And some districts are starting that process, but at the same time, there are some communities that really want to have their own superintendent or really want to have their own business manager or whatever. That's a hard thing to overcome.
Well, these things just tug at a community's heart. to have to lose anything. I mean, when we lost the little one-room schoolhouses, it was a big thing. And when we lost, you know, a small elementary school in a community, it's a big thing. If we lose a college campus out of most of these rural communities, that's part of the economic engine that drives that community. So it's a tough thing for legislators to deal with, to have to make those kind of choices. And I know they prefer not to make those kind of choices, and who would like to make those, but it just seems that as our resources are dwindling, we're going to have to make some real hard choices.
Oh, yeah. And one thing I would say is that I think Minsky, with their administrative consolidation, has in fact realized quite a few savings in that regard. And I don't know to the extent that they're doing it on these small rural schools, but across that system, they're moving to quite a bit of online learning, and that helps make staffing more efficient, because you can have students in Wadena and Staples taking a course out of Duluth or whatever by a faculty member out of Duluth, or maybe even out of Winona. It doesn't make any difference where the faculty. So I think they're realizing some benefits as a result of that merger.
Michael, I know Brainerd and Crosby have both dealt with huge cuts that have affected their athletic programs, and these communities have felt that that's so important that they've raised the money to keep them going.
And you wonder how long they can do that. I mean, they put together a package for, I think, for a 2-year period, but can they do that indefinitely?
It seems like a big mountain to climb, doesn't it?
I worry about the fees we're charging those kids
Yes.
for those programs.
Yeah.
Geez, I worry that we're squeezing some families out of that participation because of those fees.
Some kids who could benefit from participating in fine arts or extracurriculars don't have the opportunities.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's probably one of the most depressing times in a way for people who are in this business, education, but probably at the same time, it's a pretty exciting time to look at innovation that's probably going to be driven by this, isn't it?
Well, I think so. I think, you know, somebody said that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and in some respects it's possible to get greater innovation in a time of really serious fiscal distress, and I think that's one of the encouraging aspects of this. I think
we need some serious leadership at this time at the local, regional, and the state level, from legislators and others, the governor. This is a tough time for us.
Well, I thank you all for being here. Lee, Joe, and Mike. We may have to come back and visit about this because it's not going to go away. Thank you. Thanks a lot. You've been watching Lakeland Currents, where we're talking about what you're talking about. Good job, guys.